American agriculture didn't just lose crops to disease, drought, or bad luck. It lost them on purpose. Banned by governments, bred for the wrong trade, replaced by cheaper imports, or ignored because the fruit couldn't survive a truck ride. 7 crops, 7 decisions, all of them documented. Some of these you've eaten without knowing what's missing. One of them you've probably never tasted at all. About 70 years ago, breeders noticed that some tomatoes ripened from green to red unevenly. The shoulders near the stem stayed green longer than the rest. Shoppers didn't like the look. Farmers couldn't tell when to pick. So breeders selected for a mutation that made tomatoes ripen uniformly, a solid red, all at once. The problem? A 2012 study at UC Davis published in Science found that the same mutation disabled a gene that regulates chlorophyll. That chlorophyll produced the sugars that gave the tomato its flavor. When the green shoulders went, the flavor went with them. Researchers examined 25 commercial varieties from around the world. The mutation was in 100% of them. Then in 2017, University of Florida geneticist Harry Klee and an international team sequenced 398 tomato varieties. They identified 13 flavor-producing volatile compounds that had been significantly reduced in modern commercial tomatoes compared to their heirlooms, not by accident, by decades of breeding for size, firmness, shelf life, and uniform color. Nobody was selecting for taste. Nobody was being paid for taste. The flavor just eroded, gene by gene, until most Americans forgot what a tomato was supposed to taste like. The genes are documented. They could be bred back in. Nobody has. 4,000 years ago, amaranth was one of the most important crops in the Americas. The Aztecs cultivated it alongside corn and beans. It was a tribute crop. Provinces paid their taxes in amaranth seed. It was central to religious ceremonies, mixed with honey and shaped into figures for festivals. When the Spanish arrived, they understood exactly how important it was. Cortés banned amaranth cultivation, the punishment for growing it, having your hands cut off. The ban wasn't about agriculture. It was about control. Destroying the crop meant destroying the ceremonies, the food system, and the culture built around it. Amaranth survived in small mountain plots and wild populations. In the 1970s, American researchers rediscovered it and called it one of the most nutritious grains on earth, higher in protein than wheat, rich in lysine, drought tolerant. The National Academy of Sciences published a report in 1975 calling it one of the world's most promising food plants. The grain industry ignored it. Today, amaranth is a health food novelty in America, not a staple, and the wild populations that sustained it for millennia are shrinking under herbicide drift from commodity fields. America's oldest fiber crop, criminalized overnight. Hemp was one of the first crops planted in colonial America. Virginia's colonial legislature required every farmer to grow it. George Washington grew it at Mount Vernon. John Adams wrote about it. The Declaration of Independence was drafted on hemp paper. For 200 years, hemp was a primary source of rope, cloth, canvas, paper, and seed oil. The word canvas itself comes from cannabis. The U.S. Navy ran on hemp rigging. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act effectively criminalized hemp cultivation in the United States, lumping the fiber crop in with its psychoactive cousin, despite the two having fundamentally different chemistry. The lobbying behind the ban included interest in synthetic fibers and wood pulp paper, who stood to profit from hemp's removal. A crop that had been grown in American soil since the 1600s was illegal by 1938. Farmers who had grown it for generations stopped planting overnight. The USDA had published a film called Hemp for Victory during World War II, urging farmers to grow it for the war effort, then classified the film after the war and denied it existed for decades. Hemp cultivation wasn't legalized again at the federal level until the 2018 Farm Bill, 81 years later. By then, the infrastructure, the seed varieties, and the generational knowledge were gone. The pawpaw, the largest native fruit nobody commercialized. The pawpaw is the largest edible fruit native to North America, custard-textured, tasting like a cross between banana and mango. The Shawnee had a month in their calendar named for it. George Washington ate them cold for dessert. Lewis and Clark survived on them when supplies ran low. It grows wild in 26 states. You have almost certainly never bought one. The fruit bruises on contact, ripens to fermentation within days of picking, and has a shelf life of 2 to 3 days. It cannot survive the industrial food chain. No long-distance shipping, no warehouse storage, no grocery store display case. When the post-war food system consolidated around fruits that could travel 1,500 miles in a refrigerated truck, the pawpaw was left behind. Much of its wild population was lost during colonial deforestation, and the indigenous communities who had managed it for millennia were displaced. Kentucky State University now runs the world's largest pawpaw research program, trying to breed a sturdier fruit. But the pawpaw didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because the system was built to exclude anything that couldn't ship. Turkey red wheat, the open-pollinated grain the seed industry replaced. In the 1870s, Mennonite immigrants fleeing Russia carried sacks of a hard winter wheat called Turkey red to the plains of Kansas. It was drought-tolerant, cold-hardy, and perfectly adapted to the conditions that had defeated every previous wheat variety in the region. Farmers saved their own seed, selected the best performers, and replanted year after year, breeding hundreds of locally adapted lines across the Great Plains. If you saw my video on the free seed program, this is the same story. Once the commercial seed industry scaled up proprietary varieties, bred for uniformity and yield, sold new every season, the open pollinated lines that farmers had spent decades improving were ripped out and replaced. The incentive was the same one that killed the free seed program. Most of the original Turkey red lines were never conserved. The wheat that transformed the Great Plains into America's breadbasket were replaced by the industry it created. You can't sell what farmers can grow for themselves. Sorghum syrup, the South's sweetener before corn took over. Before high fructose corn syrup, before cane sugar was cheap, sorghum syrup was the primary sweetener in the rural South and across Appalachia. Families grew their own sorghum, pressed the cane in community mills every fall, and cooked the juice into a thick amber syrup that went on biscuits, into baked beans, over cornbread, and into gingerbread. At its peak, the USDA reported over 20 million gallons of sorghum syrup produced annually. It was local, it was seasonal, and for millions of Americans, it was the only sweetener they knew. And federal corn subsidies made high fructose corn syrup the cheapest sweetener in America. HFCS entered the food system in the 1970s, and within 2 decades had displaced sorghum syrup, cane sugar, and nearly every other regional sweetener. The community sorghum mills closed. Thousands of them across the South and Midwest. The crop that had sweetened the country for over a century was reduced to a niche product sold at farmers markets and heritage food festivals. Most Americans under 50 have never tasted it. The records show sorghum syrup wasn't outperformed, it was out-subsidized. The sunflower was domesticated by Native Americans at least 5,000 years ago, possibly before. They bred the wild, multi-headed, tiny-seeded plant into a single-stemmed crop with large seed heads. They used the seeds for flour, oil, snacks, dye, and medicine. It was one of the most important crops on the continent. Spanish explorers took it to Europe around 1500, where it was treated as an ornamental. Then Russia changed everything. The Russian Orthodox Church banned many oils during Lent, but sunflower oil wasn't on the list. Demand exploded. Russian breeding programs spent decades developing high-oil, high-yield varieties. By the late 1800s, Russian immigrants brought these improved varieties back to North America under names like Mammoth Russian. The crop that Native Americans had domesticated over 5 millennia was reintroduced to its own continent as a foreign product. The commercial seed industry had no reason to preserve thousands of indigenous land races when high-yield Russian hybrids were already available. Only about 30 Native American sunflower varieties have been preserved. Many of them are likely extinct. America didn't lose the sunflower, it lost the original, and replaced it with someone else's version of its own crop. 7 crops, 7 different stories, the same pattern in every one. Something that worked, sometimes for centuries, sometimes for millennia, was replaced, banned, ignored, or bred into something unrecognizable because the economics pointed somewhere else. What stays with me is how quiet each one was. Nobody announced that the tomato was losing its flavor. Nobody held a hearing when the sorghum mills closed. The sunflower didn't make the news when it came home as a foreign crop. Each loss was small enough to miss and large enough to matter, and the records are there for every one of them. USDA reports, university studies, breeding, program archives, colonial legislation. Nobody hid the evidence. It just wasn't profitable to read. The one I can't let go of is the tomato. Every American has eaten the result of that decision, and most of them had no idea the flavor was documented, identified, and bred out while nobody was paying attention. That's not a loss from the past. That's dinner tonight. Which one of these surprised you most? Drop it in the comments. I want to know which story deserves the full investigation. And if someone you know would want to hear this, send it their way. Every one of the 7 has a full story behind it, and I'm going deeper on whichever one you pick. Subscribe so you're here when it drops.